Only one of them screamed.
His own words. One squealed a bit, so he didn't have time to clip the lady's ears off and send them to the police.
A right comedian, this one. A real jolly Jack the Ripper.
You'd think we'd get enough murder mayhem on the job.
Well, doctors go over old case histories. Architects study ancient buildings.
So we investigate celebrated crime.
You're the one who hates mysteries.
You're the one with the track record.
Yes. Every murder I've been on was cleared up.
So clear up these.
They had 8 inspectors on the case.
And 2 Lancashire Jacks are worth how many from the south?
Well, at least we are Jacks. Starting with the evidence and testing some theories. Not starting with the theory and selecting the evidence.
Busman's holiday.
Aye. We're using strict workaday methods.
Following our noses, though.
And the facts.
And the figures. You sticking to 5 murders?
Agreeing with Sir Melville Macnaughton, head of CID for Scotland Yard. The Whitechapel murderer committed 5 murders and no more.
I've never much taken to the view from the very top.
So at your level?
I'll stick with 5 all the same. There were others, but these 5 all had their throats cut.
It was one of Mulatto's trademarks. Let's check my list, eh? Number 1.
Nichols. Mary Ann, otherwise known as Polly.
Date?
Friday, August the 31st, 1888.
Number 2.
Chapman, Dark Annie. Saturday, September the 8th.
Next?
The double event. Elizabeth Stride, Long Liz. She was the one who screamed. Around midnight, Sunday, September the 30th. She was number 3. And number 4 was Catherine Eddowes. About an hour later.
And finally?
Kelly, Mary Kelly. Sometime in the morning of Friday, November the 9th, 1888.
Right, that's a lot then.
Unless you count Mrs. Burridge.
Who?
Mrs. Burridge.
Well, that name doesn't appear on any of my lists.
She's still an extra victim. Mrs. Burridge was a lady who ran a business in the Blackfriars Road. She got such a nasty turn reading about the second murder in the papers that she dropped down dead. I don't blame her either. Listen to this. This is the bit she was reading. A nameless reprobate, half beast, half man, is at large. Hideous malice, deadly cunning, insatiable thirst for blood. All these are the marks of the mad homicide. The ghoul-like creature stalking down his victim like a Pawnee Indian is simply drunk with blood, and he will have more.
And he did. 3 more victims.
And a fair amount of blood from the start. The testimony of PC 97 Neil, J Division.
I was proceeding down Bucks Row, Whitechapel, going towards Brady Street at 3:45 a.m. on the morning of Friday, August the 31st. There was not a soul about. I'd been there half an hour previous, and I saw no one then. I was on the right-hand side of the road when I noticed a figure lying in the street. It was dark at the time, though there was a street lamp shining at the end of the row. I went across and found deceased lying outside a gateway, Head towards the east. The gateway was closed. Deceased was lying lengthways along the street, her left hand touching the gate. I examined the body by the aid of my lamp and noticed blood oozing from a wound in the throat. She was lying on her back with her clothes disarranged. I felt her arm, which was quite warm from the joints upwards. Her bonnet was off and lying by her side, close to the left hand. Her eyes were wide open. I heard a constable pass in Brady Street, so I called him. I said, "Run for Dr. Llewellyn." The doctor arrived in a very short time. He looked at the woman and then he said, "Move the woman to the mortuary. She's dead. I'll make a further examination of her." We then placed her on the ambulance and moved her there. Inspector Spratling came to the mortuary and while taking a description of the deceased, turned up her clothes and found that she was disemboweled.
Having moved and while taking a description, they discover she's been hacked to pieces? Were they all drunk or blind or what?
Dr. Llewellyn didn't seem bothered. Not even at the inquest.
I was called by the police at about 4 o'clock. When I arrived, the woman had apparently been dead about half an hour. Her throat was deeply cut. About an hour afterwards, I was sent for again by the police, and on going to the mortuary where the body had been carried, I found most extensive injuries to the abdomen. At 10 o'clock the following morning, Saturday, I carried out a post-mortem. There were 2 cuts in the throat, one 4 inches long, the other 8. The large vessels of the neck on both sides were severed. The incisions had also completely severed all the tissues down to the vertebrae, which had also been penetrated. These wounds must have been caused by a long-bladed knife. Then, in the lower part of the abdomen, 2 or 3 inches from the left side, was a wound running in a jagged manner. It was a very deep wound, and the tissues had been cut through. There were several incisions running across the abdomen. On the right side, there were also 3 or 4 similar cuts running downwards. All these had been caused by a knife, which had been used violently and used downwards. As far as the throat is concerned, the weapon appeared to have been held in the left hand of the person who used it. Similarly, the wounds in the abdomen ran from left to right and might have been done by a left-handed person. The murderer must also have had some rough anatomical knowledge. He seems to have attacked all the vital parts. I would say the murder might have occupied 4 or 5 minutes.
And I'd say he's a dozy doctor.
Still, it's a start. Worth entering?
Yes, I suppose so. Left-handed, maybe. Anatomical knowledge. Strong.
Strong left-handed doctor.
Plenty of other people about with rough anatomical knowledge. You and me for a start.
Aye. And some others who turned up a bit sharp.
The first people on the scene, after I discovered the body, were 2 men working at the slaughterhouse opposite. They said they had not heard any screams.
Too busy on other dumb carcasses, I suppose.
Well, let's stay with them a mo. The bodies, I mean. Sort of mute witnesses. There might be a pattern in their injuries.
Right, so victim number 2, Annie Chapman.
Dark Annie. Found murdered Saturday the 8th of September, just 8 days after the 1st.
Not the same doctor, I hope.
No, but the same coroner. Wynne Baxter, with the inquest on Polly Nichols not even finished, has Annie Chapman on his hands as well.
But a different doctor?
Yes.
George Bagster Phillips, 2 Spittal Square. I am a divisional surgeon of police and have been for 23 years. At 6:20 on Saturday morning, I was called by the police to 29 Hanbury Street and arrived there at 6:30. I found the dead body of a female in the possession of the police. The body was terribly mutilated. I searched the yard and I found a small piece of coarse muslin and a pocket comb in a paper case lying at the feet of the woman. They had apparently been placed there in order or arranged there. On the wooden paling between the yard in question and the next, there were smears of blood corresponding to where the head of the deceased lay. Soon after 2 o'clock on Saturday, I went to the labour yard of the Whitechapel Union for the purpose of further examining the body. I was surprised to find that the body had been stripped and was lying ready on the table for my examination. It was only under great difficulty that I was able to make my examination. And since on so many occasions I have met with similar difficulties, I now wish to protest, as I have previously done, that the members of my profession should be called upon to perform our duties in these inadequate circumstances. There are no adequate conveniences for carrying out a post-mortem examination whatsoever. Indeed, in summer weather, that shed is dangerous to the health of the operator.
As a matter of fact, Dr. Phillips, there is no public mortuary in the city of London up as far as Bow.
Furthermore, the body had obviously been attended to since its removal to the mortuary, evidently to be washed. There was a bruise over the right temple, and there were 2 distinct bruises, each the size of the top of a man's thumb, on the forepart of the top of the chest. The throat had been severed. There were 2 distinct, clean cuts. It appeared as though an attempt had been made to separate the bones of the neck. There were various other mutilations of the body, but I am of the opinion that they occurred subsequent to death. I think I had better not go into further detail of these mutilations, which can only be painful to the feelings of the jury and the public.
We will allow that for the moment. Can you offer any opinion as to the weapon which was used by the murderer?
It must have been a very sharp knife, with a thin, narrow blade, at least 6 to 8 inches in length, probably longer. The injuries could have been done by such an instrument as a medical man uses for post-mortem purposes, but ordinary surgical cases might not contain such an instrument. There were indications of anatomical knowledge. The whole of the body was not present. The absent portions are from the abdomen. The way in which those portions were extracted showed anatomical knowledge.
The coroner took that speech about withholding evidence pretty lightly, didn't he?
No. When the inquest was resumed, he had Dr. Phillips back on the stand. Phillips made him fight for the information, though.
Dr. Phillips, whatever may be your opinion or objections, it appears to me necessary that all the evidence that you ascertained at the post-mortem examination should be on the records of the court, for various reasons which I need not enumerate. However painful it may be, it is necessary in the interests of justice.
I have not had notice of that. I should have been glad if notice had been given me, because I should have been better prepared to give the evidence. However, I will do my best.
Would you like to postpone it?
Oh, no. I will do my best.
Can you give any indication of how long it would take to perform the incisions found on the body?
I think I can guide you by saying that I myself could not have performed all the injuries that I saw on that woman and effect them even without a struggle under a quarter of an hour. I still think it is a very great pity to make this evidence public. These details are fit only for yourself, sir, and the jury.
We are here in the interests of justice and must have all the evidence before us. I see, however, that there are several ladies and boys in the room. I think they might retire.
I still feel that in giving these details to the public, you are thwarting the ends of justice.
We are bound to take all the evidence in the case. And whether it is made public or not is a matter for the responsibility of the press.
We are of the opinion that the evidence the doctor on the last occasion wished to keep back should be heard.
I have carefully considered the matter, and I've never before heard of any evidence requested being kept back.
I have not kept it back. I have only suggested whether it should be given or not.
We have delayed taking this evidence as long as possible because you said that the interests of justice might be served by keeping it back. But it is now a fortnight since this occurred, and I do not see why it should be kept back from the jury any longer.
I am of the opinion that what I am about to describe took place after death. so that it could not affect the cause of death which you are inquiring into.
That is only your opinion, and might be repudiated by other medical opinion.
Very well. I will give you the results of my post-mortem examination.
And according to the Illustrated Police News, witness then detailed the terrible wounds which had been inflicted upon the woman and described the parts of the body which the perpetrator of the murder had carried away with him. None of the newspapers printed it, but the Lancet did.
So let's have it.
I quote, "The abdomen had been entirely laid open, the intestines severed from their mesenteric attachments, I'm not quite sure what they are, had been lifted out of the body and placed by the shoulder of the corpse, whilst from the pelvis, the uterus and its appendages, with the upper portion of the vagina and the posterior two-thirds of the bladder, had been entirely removed. Obviously, the work was that of an expert, of one, at least, who had such knowledge of anatomical or pathological examinations as to be enabled to secure the pelvic organs with one sweep of a knife."
That all?
Yes?
I've heard worse. Though not much worse.
It seems to have shaken Mr. Coroner Wynne Baxter, though. Talk about a sensational summing up.
The wretch must have seized the deceased, perhaps after some Judas-like approaches. He seized her by the chin, he pressed her throat, and while thus preventing the slightest cry, he produced insensibility and suffocation. All was done with cool impudence and reckless daring. The murder seems, like the killing in Bucks Row, to have been carried out without any cry. The brute who committed the offense did not even take the trouble to cover up his ghastly work. An organ was taken from the abdomen. Taken by one who knew where to find it, what difficulties he would have to contend with, and how he should use his knife. The conclusion is that the desire to possess that missing organ was overwhelming. It has been suggested that the criminal was a lunatic with morbid feelings. That might or might not be so, but it is not necessary to assume lunacy. There was a market for that missing organ. Within a few hours of the issue of the morning paper containing a report of the medical evidence given in this inquest, I received a communication from an officer of one of our great medical schools. He said he had information for me. I attended him without delay, and I was told that some months ago an American had called on him and had asked him to procure a number of specimens of the organ that was missing in the deceased. He said he was willing to give £20 for each specimen. It was known, I was told, that he had repeated his request to another institution. Now, is it not possible that the knowledge of this demand might have incited some abandoned wretch? It seems almost beyond belief that such inhuman wickedness could enter the mind of any man, but unfortunately, our criminal annals prove that every crime is possible. By means of the press, some further explanation may be forthcoming, either from America, if not from here. And it is surely not too much to hope that even yet, the ingenuity of our detective force will succeed in unearthing this monster.
That's all they needed at that time. The idea that a specialized Burke and Hare character was setting himself up in business.
Stirring things up.
It was the nature of the missing organs that upset them, though. Neither Dr. Phillips nor the coroner would have been anything like as bothered if our Jack had ripped her apart and walked off with her left leg.
Well, it's hardly the same thing, is it?
And it wouldn't have taken a quarter of an hour.
Yeah. That's right. I'm sure Phillips was right about anatomical knowledge. Yeah, there's a stamp about this murder, and that is confidence.
Think we can get rid of that query?
And Phillips confirms left-handed.
So, a pattern of throat cutting and mutilation?
And a pattern of victims.
Certainly with these two.
So, back to number one, Nichols.
On the streets. Or as the Victorians said, an unfortunate.
Age?
About 40, height 5'2". Married. Had 5 children. Husband kicked her out because she drank. Lived for a while in Lambeth Workhouse, then in various common lodging houses in Spitalfields. When found, contents of pockets were a handkerchief, a comb, and a bit of broken looking glass. That was Mary Ann Nichols.
Age about 40. Body discovered 3:45 a.m. Time of murder? According to P.C. Neal's evidence, between 3:15 and 3:45 a.m. Last seen alive?
She was turned away from the lodging house she'd been staying at. She shared a room with 3 other women, but that night she didn't have the money for a bed. 4pence. According to the people who saw her there, she'd been drinking, but she wasn't drunk. She went off saying, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." Apparently she had a bonnet nobody had seen her wearing before.
P.C. Neal mentioned it. It was found by the body.
Didn't seem to help her much. She was still trying to earn her 4pence when she met Emily Holland.
It was a Friday morning, about 2:30. I was coming home from a fire, which I'd been to see at Ratcliffe. I see her at the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road, just outside a grocer's shop. She was on her own. She was the worse for drink. She was staggering a bit. We were talking for 7 or 8 minutes, and while we were talking, the clock at Whitechapel Church struck 2:30. I tried to persuade her to come home with me, as she was the worse for drink, and I would find her lodgings where I was living. But she wouldn't come. She said, "I've had my lodging money 3 times today and I've spent it." And then she turned towards Whitechapel and went down there. She didn't say she was meeting anyone. She said she hadn't any money and that she must make up the amount of her lodging. She said, "It won't be long before I'll be back."
Half drunk and desperate for 4pence.
Living and partly living.
Like victim number 2, Annie Chapman.
Dark Annie. Well, the Star newspaper called her a defenseless walker of the streets. The Daily Chronicle was rougher and said she was of the unfortunate class and was particularly well known as a haunter of the low public houses in the vicinity. Height, 5 foot. Age, about 45. She had a friend called Amelia Palmer or Farmer. It depends which newspaper you read.
I have seen the body, and I'm quite sure it's the body of Annie Chapman. She was the widow of Frederick Chapman. He died about 18 months ago. She'd been living apart from him for the past 4 years, mainly in the lodging houses. I saw her several times last week. Last Monday, she had a bruise on one of her temples and also a bruise on her chest. She said they'd been done by a woman what had been with a man called Harry the Hawker. She said she went into a pub and Harry the Hawker was there. He was drunk. He put down a florin, and the woman changed it for a penny, and he stopped her. And that caused the ill feeling that led to the fight. The next time I met her, she said she did not feel well, so she'd go into the casual ward and try and pull round. I'll give her 2pence to buy a cup of tea. And I told her not to get any rum, because I'd frequently seen her the worse for drink. I'm afraid she used to earn her living partly on the streets. Oh, she was a very straightforward woman when she was sober, clever and industrious with her needle, but she couldn't take much drink. She'd been leading a very irregular life all the time I'd known her.
With friends like Mrs. Palmer, who needs enemies?
She met one, though. Now, number 1, Polly Nichols was killed between 3:15 and 3:45 in the morning. Now, who was the last person to see Annie Chapman alive and when?
My name is Timothy Donovan. I am the deputy of a common lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, Spitalfield. It was about 7 o'clock that Friday. Annie Chapman came to the lodging house and asked me if I'd let her go down into the kitchen. I asked her where she'd been all week, and she said, in the infirmary. I then let her go into the kitchen. She stayed there until just before 2 o'clock next morning. When she went out, she said, I haven't any money now, but don't let the bed. I'll be back soon. She then left the house. She had had enough to drink, but she was well able to walk straight.
Another one like a lamb to the slaughter. Staggering off, looking for a man to take into a dark alley.
Ah, but she wasn't staggering. Donovan said she could walk quite straight. Now, she was last seen alive just before 2 a.m. When was the body discovered?
My name is John Richardson. I'm a porter at Spitalfields Market. I help my mother in her packing case business at 29 Ambury Street. I was at the house on Saturday morning. I got there between 1:15 and 10 minutes to 5. I lifted the latch and went through the passage to the yard. The door was closed. I opened it, but I didn't go into the yard. I sat on the doorstep and cut a piece of leather off my boot with an old table knife which I bought from home. I was there about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes at the outside. It was beginning to get light, but not thoroughly. I could see all over. I couldn't have failed to have noticed the dead woman as she had been lying there. I was sitting on the second step with my feet on the flags of the yard, quite close to where the woman was found.
Well, there's the yard, steps. The body was here how far from the steps?
Hang on a minute. 9 inches.
Well, I mean, if we accept his evidence, there was no body in that yard at 4:50.
Albert Kadosh, carpenter. I live at number 27 Ambury Street. Number 27 is next door to number 29. On Saturday, I got up about 5:15 and went into the yard. It was then about 5:20. As I returned towards the back door, I heard a voice say, "No," just as I was going through the door. It was not in our yard, but I should think it was in the yard of number 29. I went indoors, but I went back out to the yard about 3 or 4 minutes later. As I was going back, I heard a sort of fall against the fence. It seems as if something touched the fence suddenly. I didn't look to see what it was, and I didn't hear any other noise. I then went in the house and out into the street to go to work. It was about 2 minutes after 5:30 as I passed Spitalfield Church.
I didn't look to see what it was. Oh, it's nosy beggars like Albert Kadosh that make police work so easy.
Just standard Whitechapel practice.
Still, if that's something that suddenly seemed to touch the fence was Chapman's body being lowered to the ground, the approximate time of murder, 5:25.
Hang on a minute, though. There was another witness at the coroner's inquest, Elizabeth Long.
I was passing down Hambury Street from home, going to Spitalfield Market. It was about 5:30. I'm certain of the time because the brewer's clock had just struck as I passed 29 Hambury Street. I was on the right-hand side of the street, the same side as number 29. I saw a man and woman on the pavement talking. The man's back was turned towards Brick Lane and the woman's towards Spitalfield Market. They were talking together and were close up against the shutters of number 29. I saw the woman's face. I've since seen the dead woman in the mortuary, and I'm sure it's the face of the same person I saw in Ambury Street. I couldn't see the man's face except to notice he was dark. He had a brown deerstalker hat, and I think he had a dark coat on, but I'm not quite sure about that. I couldn't say what age he was, but he looked over 40, and he looked a little taller than the woman. He looked like a foreigner. He had a shabby, genteel appearance. I could hear them talking loudly. He says to her, "Will you?" She said yes. They were still standing there as I passed. I didn't look back.
She saw him. She saw Jack the Ripper. It must have been him. If that was Chapman, in a couple of minutes she was dead.
Time doesn't fit with Albert Kadosh. He heard the bump against the fence at 5:25.
Yeah, but it's not far out. Let's get that description again.
Dark. Brown deerstalker. She's not sure about the dark coat, and it isn't much help anyway. Over 40. He looked like a foreigner.
No. She knew that he'd done an horrible murder. And anybody who could have done an horrible murder would have looked like a foreigner. But that other description, though, shabby, genteel, that has more of a realistic ring about it. Does it suggest anything to you?
Clerk of some kind?
Aye, or somebody who was genteel but dressed up in old clothes to look shabby.
A lot of people at the time thought it was a toff.
Worth bearing in mind, then. Yeah, there's a picture beginning to build up. Left-handed, anatomical knowledge, dark, brown deerstalker. Over 40, shabby genteel.
Must have been a fair number of men knocking around London who fitted that.
That's a start. Why did he wait so long?
Hmm? How do you mean?
Why did he wait so long to kill Chapman?
Until 5:30.
Until it had got quite light. Until there were people about. He could have been seen. He could have got caught. So why did he wait so long? There's an obvious pattern to the victims. Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, Kelly. All prostitutes or low-class ones as well. On the bottle, ill, getting old.
Except Kelly, the last one.
Oh, granted, agreed. But let's stick with the first two. Out walking the streets at night because they couldn't get fourpence for a bed.
They wouldn't have been the only ones who'd drunk the lodging money. Not out of 80,000.
How many?
80,000 unfortunates was a conservative estimate. What it must have been like.
Crowded?
Crowded is one way of putting it. That yard in Hanbury Street where Dark Annie was found dead. The landlady of number 29 gave evidence at the inquest. She was John Richardson's mother.
I run a packing case business in the house and the yard with my son. I occupy the first floor front room.
That's one.
And my grandson, aged 14, sleeps in the same room.
2.
An old gentleman, Mr. Walker, occupies the first floor back.
3.
He shares a room with his son, who is about 27. His son's an imbecile, weak-minded.
4.
On the ground floor is Mrs. Hardiman, a widow with one son, 16 years old. They sleep in the same room. She's a cat's meat saleswoman.
6, and a lot of cat's meat.
Mr. Thompson and his wife, an adopted little girl, occupy the second floor front.
9.
2 Mrs. Huxley live on the second floor back. They're sisters and work in a cigar factory.
11.
Mr. John Davis and his wife and 3 sons occupy the third floor front.
16.
And an old lady, Mrs. Sarah Cox, whom I keep, occupies the third floor back. I keep her out of charity.
17.
The front and back doors are always left open. You only have to raise up the latch with your finger and you can get in any one of the houses about there. The houses in that area are all let out in rooms.
Do people quite often just walk through the passageway and out through the back?
People do frequently pass through.
People go there who have no business to do so?
Yes, I dare say they do.
Do people go through it into the yard for immoral purposes?
I should not allow any stranger to go through for an immoral purpose if I know it.
In fact, according to her son, he was always turfing prostitutes and men out of the yard and off the first floor landing as well. And that was a respectable private dwelling. Not a common lodging house, the sort of place Annie Chapman and Polly Nichols paid the fourpences to sleep in.
Makes the slums of the Scotty Road, as I remember them, sound like a garden city.
Here, Mrs. Barnett, who with her husband founded Toynbee Hall, full of good works.
When we first came to St. Jude's in Whitechapel, my husband was told by the bishop that it was the worst parish in the district. There were some 6,000 people, mainly men, crowded into a maze of insanitary courts and alleys. To get into the courts is to walk through the stench of evil-smelling gases rising from sewage and refuse scattered in all directions. The sun never penetrates into them, and they're never visited by a breath of fresh air. Many of them are built on what used to be the gardens of the houses in front. Often they aren't even called houses or dwellings or even a yard, just so-and-so's rents, from the name of the man who makes money from those who exist there. Nearby in Frederick Street, Brunswick Street, and Radcliffe Highway are the streets where what they call the leggers' moles live. They are the women who prey on the sailors who come ashore there. A visitor from France went down there and was appalled by what he saw. I'll read you what he wrote. 3 times in 10 minutes, I saw crowds collect around doorways attracted by fights, especially by fights between women. One of them, her face covered with blood, tears in her eyes, drunk, was trying to fly at a man while the mob watched and laughed. And as if the uproar were a signal, the population of the neighboring alleyways came pouring out into the streets. Children in rags, paupers, women, as if a human sewer was suddenly clearing itself. I'm afraid drink is responsible for much of the degradation. A measure of gin costs 3 halfpence, and you can tell how popular it is by the many names they give it. Blue Ruin, Max, Duke, Gatter, Jackie. It breeds violence and cruelty. But even for those who try to find work to better themselves, there's little chance. The matchbox makers, of whom there are many in the district, they are paid 2pence 3 farthings a gross. And for that, they have to find their own fire to dry the boxes, their own paste and string. For the past 2 years, Mr. Booth, who has spent much time with us at Toynbee Hall, has been drawing up what he calls his poverty maps of London. Of some 900,000 living in East London, he says over 1/3 are in poverty or want.
Those whom I call poor are those living under a constant struggle to make the necessities of life. Below them are the very poor. They live in a state of chronic want. And I can best illustrate what I mean by giving you 1 or 2 examples. This family, for example, Mr. R. Mr. R, the father, is old and blind. He has a weekly pension of 5 shillings and 6pence. His wife only earns money at hopping or fruit picking. She keeps the house clean, and she and her husband are reputed to be quite sober. There are 4 daughters at home. The eldest, a rough girl, has ruined her health at the local lead works. She does sack making or bottle washing. But when I came across them in March, had earned only 2 shillings since Christmas. 2 other girls give the mother 6 shillings a week each, and the youngest is at school. The family house money, therefore, to support 6 people is 17 shillings and 6pence a week. The family live to the greatest possible extent from hand to mouth. They buy almost everything from one shop on credit. In addition, every week they put in and they take out of pawn the same set of garments, on which the broker every week advances them 16 shillings. He charges 4pence for doing so. They therefore pay 4pence a week for the comfort of having a week's income in advance. On the other hand, even living on credit as they do, they buy nothing until it is actually needed. They go to the shop as an ordinary housewife goes to the canisters. They buy tea twice a day. In 35 days, they made 72 purchases of tea. All of them are most carefully noted down. A pinch of tea costs 3 farthings. This is half an ounce at 2 shillings a pound. Of sugar, there were 77 purchases in the same time.
There are some 10,000 people here whom Mr. Booth describes as very poor, living in chronic want. And those whom he describes as poor living in Whitechapel, they number 49%. Half the people here are on the margin of existence. As my husband tells his audiences when he goes to speak at Oxford and elsewhere, the people here live often without health, without knowledge, and without hope.
Much more of that, and we'll be calling Jack the Ripper a mercy killer.
Not the way the locals saw him. They were getting panicky.
A number of sensational stories are spreading through Whitechapel. There's a tale that writing was seen on the wall of number 29, Hanbury Street, saying, "I have now done 3 and intend to do 9 more and then give myself up." One version of the story says some such threat as 5, 15 more and I'd give myself up was written on a piece of paper that was picked up.
The crowds in Spitalfields during the day have been causing great difficulty. This morning, 2 men were arrested for minor offences. On each occasion, a large crowd formed and rushed after the police, shouting, "The murderer's caught!" Another man, injured in a quarrel, was carried to the station on a stretcher. The crowd formed outside the station and declined to disperse. A further arrest was made of a man for whom there had been a warrant out for some time. People came pouring out of the market, from the courts, and out of the public houses, shouting that he was one of the gang and they were going to lynch him. A very large crowd gathered, and the constables present had their work cut out to prevent the man being torn to pieces. The barrack doors of the station were closed the moment the man had been brought in. A number of constables were stationed outside to prevent the mob rushing the doors. In addition, a gang of youths started to march down Hanbury Street. They were shouting, "Down with the Jews! It was a Jew that did it!" They were dispersed, but despite this, a number of fights occurred. A very large number of men were held in reserve and rushed to wherever trouble began. However, as night fell, the numbers of mobs expressing open antipathy to the Jews grew in number, and a request had to be forwarded to headquarters for more men.
Mobs of people rushing around the streets on the lookout for any odd character. Rumours flying from pub to pub. The whole area working itself into a fine state.
Like Mrs. Fiddymont.
Who?
Mrs. Fiddymont spoke to the reporters from the newspapers. They loved Mrs. Fiddymont. She was the landlady of the Prince Albert, about half a mile from Hanbury Street.
It was 7 o'clock that morning. I was standing in the bar talking with a friend. Suddenly, a man come in. The look of him was enough to frighten me. He had a brown stiff hat, dark coat, no waistcoat. He had that down over his eyes and his face was partly hidden. He asked for half a pint of 4 ale, but what struck me particularly was that there was blood spots on the back of his right hand. And his shirt was torn. He swallowed his beer and went straight out again. My friend went out to watch him. My friend is Mrs. Mary Chappell. She lives at number 28, Stewart Street.
It was the expression in his eyes, his look. It was so startling and terrifying. Well, it frightened Mrs. Fiddymont. She asked me to stay with her. His shirt was torn into rags at the shoulder, and there was a narrow streak of blood under his right ear along the edge of his shirt. But it was his eyes. His eyes were as wild as a hawk's.
There are enough Mrs. Fiddymonts around today without you digging them up from the past.
Wait, there's more. From the Star. Today, Mrs. Fiddymont added to her previous statement.
And the back of his head as grimy as if it had been bloody and had been dampened or spit upon, trying to get the blood off instead of washing it.
I thought he had a hat on.
Perhaps it was a very little hat.
Yeah, I know. Specially cut out to reveal bloodstains at the back and eyes like hawks at the front. I don't care about Mrs. Fiddymont. That's not quite true. She lived nearly half a mile away, and yet she was telling her story only an hour or so after the murder.
Everybody seemed to know this wasn't just another murder. Listen to this. For several hours past, the occupants of the adjoining house have been charging an admission fee of 1 penny to people who are anxious to view the spot where the body was found. Several hundreds of people have availed themselves of this opportunity.
A real sensation.
And the police going round in circles just trying to keep up with it.
There have been numerous allegations and accusations in the Whitechapel area that the murders are the work of a man known as Leather Apron. This man, who seems widely known in the area, had apparently carried out numerous assaults on women. However, he's not been seen in his regular haunts recently, although several men have been accused in the last couple of days of being him. At 8:45 in the morning of Monday, September 10th, acting on information received, I proceeded to 22 Mulberry Street, Commercial Road. I knocked on the door. It was opened by John Picer. A Picer is sometimes known in the district by the name Leather Apron. I asked Picer to accompany me to Leman Street Police Station, which he did readily. The house was searched and 5 knives were found. Picer is by trade a boot finisher. Picer was detained at Leman Street Station. He was able to account for his movements at the time of the murders. However, a large crowd had gathered, having heard a rumour that Leather Apron had been arrested. Picer was therefore kept at the station for his own protection. He was released on Tuesday, September 11th.
Sounds just like you, John.
Detective Sergeant Thick was known as Johnny Upright.
At 3 o'clock on the morning of Tuesday, September the 11th, I was summoned to a coffee stall in the Whitechapel Road. I was asked by Alexander Finlay to take into custody a man who I later learned to be the prisoner Charles Ludwig. He was drunk and in an excited condition. I was informed by Finlay, who was standing by the coffee stall, that Ludwig said to him, "What are you looking at?" He then took out a long-bladed knife and pursued Finlay around the coffee stall and made several attempts to stab him, until Finlay threatened to hit him over the head with a dish. I arrested the prisoner, and on the way to the station, the prisoner dropped a long-bladed knife, which was open. When he was searched, a razor and a pair of scissors were found on him.
I've been making inquiries into Ludwig's background. It appears he came to this country some 15 months ago. He works as a barber's assistant. He is apparently of a quarrelsome disposition. That evening he had been seen earlier at the German club, but he was drunk and the manageress had him turned out. However, there seems nothing to connect him with the murders of Nichols and Chapman.
Over 200 common lodging houses have been checked, every such place within half a mile of the murder spot. The names have been taken of those occupants who entered after 2 o'clock on the morning of the murder. A few men are still unaccounted for. None of the deputies or night watchmen questioned have any memory of any person stained with blood entering their premises. But, as many of them have pointed out, little notice is taken of persons inquiring for beds at that hour. They are simply asked for their money and shown to their rooms up a stairway that is badly lit.
Inspector Aberline was the top jack on the murders.
He was looking in the wrong place. They could have turned over those lodging houses for the next 2 years and not found him, because he wasn't there. They were looking for a down-and-outer, a leather apron figure, some character with a bad temper, a knife in his pocket and blood on his boots. But he wasn't like that, I'm sure of it. Our man wasn't like that.
I keep on coming back to the ceremony. Even the ritual of these murders.
How do you mean?
Do you remember Dr. Phillips? I found a small piece of coarse muslin and a pocket comb in a paper case lying at the feet of the woman. They had apparently been placed there in order or arranged there.
Both bodies had been laid out, arranged, but so what?
Well, let's stick with you, sir. A middle-class ripper.
Well, certainly not a working-class one, because whoever he was, he had privacy. Privacy to wash the blood off him, to get rid of whatever he had carried away in his bag. And in that area at that time, privacy was strictly a middle-class luxury.
Could be right, but wouldn't a stranger, a better-class stranger, look very odd walking about that area at 6 in the morning?
Aye. He wasn't bothered about being seen there.
So he had an excuse to be there? Was accepted there?
Accepted, maybe. Certainly not detected. Not even after 3 more murders.
Stride, Eddowes, Kelly. 2 killings in less than an hour. And for an encore, One of the nastiest pieces of butchery in the history of crime.